And welcome back. We are today going to dive into one more image that we're going to go ahead and animate before we get to the point of creating our own sprite sheets. So today, let's go ahead and start by making another 128 by 128 image. We can go ahead and leave our background as white or transparent. Doesn't matter because we're going to end up filling that with a gradient here in a second. So let's go ahead and click Create. And I'm just going to go ahead and hide the timeline right now. I don't need this open right now. So I can just go ahead and actually just close this and use Control-0 to zoom in. Here we go. Now, what I want to do to get started is I'm going to fill this with a gradient. And what I'm going to do is go ahead and make, for example, like a sunrise or a sunset. So let's go ahead and say, if I want to do a sunrise, I can come in here and do something maybe more like a blue, or I can, if I'm looking for a sunrise or sunset, I can stick with some more red. But let's just say the sun's already up in the sky, so I can pick one of these kind of bluish tones here. Might pick one that kind of works with a little bit lighter. Yeah, you can choose which one you want to go with. I'm going to take this nice one right here, and let's just go ahead and draw that in. And you can see it's lighter in the sky here, darker down here. That makes sense because the sun is, of course, going to be up in the sky here. And let's just go ahead and unlock this and rename this layer as sky. All right, so we have our sky layer. What else can we put in here? Well, we are typically going to also have some kind of ground layer, right? So let's go ahead and add a layer, call it ground. And what I'm going to do with this one, I'm going to go ahead and do another gradient here. But for this one, we don't want it to take over the whole canvas here. So we're actually going to use our rectangular selection here. And let's just go ahead and have it just take roughly the bottom portion of this. It doesn't have to be exact, but roughly the bottom portion. I'm just going to do a selection there. And again, use our gradient tool. And then this time, let's look for something that's going to be more in the greens here. All right, so here's our greens. We want something that's going to be more representative of grass. This one looks pretty good right here. And if I draw this one, you can see it gives me some nice colors I can work with. Maybe I don't want to do that one. Maybe I want to have it where the tones are more in the middle. You can play around with whichever gradient you think is going to work best for what you're working with. Again, it's up to you. But I'm just going to go ahead and stick with this one because I think this looks pretty nice. All right, I'm going to use Control-D to deselect. And let's go ahead and make a new layer again. And let's go ahead and call this layer our cloud layer. All right, because a lot of times we do have clouds in our sky, right? So how I'm going to make a cloud, and the thing is, when you make a cloud, there's several ways to do it. But I'm going to introduce a new tool today for us to be able to do so. Let's go to our brush tool for a second, or our pencil tool actually. And I'm going to go ahead and choose a white tone here. I don't necessarily need a pure white, but something that's pretty close to it will work. And let's go ahead and bring that brush size up just to give us something to get started with. This looks like a pretty good size to kind of get started with. And I could, of course, can go ahead and click and try to make a cloud this way. And I can go ahead and create a nice cloud like this. It works. However, there is ways we can kind of add some three-dimensionality to this shape here. And what I'm going to do with that is I'm actually going to come over here to my Photoshop tools. And if you look, we have a bunch of different tools here. We have blur, we have sharpen, we have smudge, there's dodge, burn, sponge. And I'm going to go to the smudge tool today. And what I'm going to do is when I grab that smudge tool, you can see as I pull that around that symbol shape I did before, it kind of actually will kind of make those nice fade effects here. And I can actually just keep pulling that cloud into it. I get it however I really want that cloud to go. And you can see there's a nice cloud there now. Look at that. Now, if I want to add maybe some functionality to, maybe I want to add a couple of the shadowing, so I'm just going to use my selection tool here. And I might say, I want it to be a little bit darker in some of that shading, so I'm just going to bring that down a little bit just to show maybe the darker side of that cloud. So once that's selected, let's go ahead and go to my brush tool. And I'm going to bring that down in size a little bit. I'm just going to kind of brush along the side here just to kind of add some darkness to the bottom of that cloud. And again, I can go ahead and deselect here, and I can again incorporate things like my smudge tool to kind of get some nice blending going here. So I'm just going to bring my brush size down here. Let's do a little bit of blending here. And this is going to add a lot of kind of three-dimensional functionality here to kind of make it so these shapes are actually popping out a lot more, rather than just being this statically defined piece that's just floating in the sky. And you can see that looks a lot more natural versus something that if I had done this with just using the brush tool and I had just made a couple blobs, pasted them all together, yeah, it can be in a cloud shape, but this gives us kind of that feathering effect that we might want. Now, of course, we can, use, let's see this with the brush tool this time. So let me just go ahead and grab that original white color or something pretty close to it. And let's use our brush tool and just see how this works in comparison. So here's one cloud, but let's say I want a second cloud. I'm going to go ahead and put that one, let's say right here. All right. So with this brush tool, you can see we can go ahead and effectively do the same thing, but this is just one more option that I have to kind of go ahead and create some of these featherings that would be present with the brush tool. And of course, we have other tools here that we can play around with. Like I said, dodge, burn. Let me bring that down. That's pretty large in size. And so when I use the burn tool, you don't necessarily see it as much, but if I just keep circling this, you notice how it kind of gets dark in there, because that's what the burn tool will do. Let me just undo this here a little bit. And so what that will actually do is allow me to actually go in and actually create effectively a dark layer. So rather than necessarily having to pick a new tone, I can use that burn tool and kind of just trace along those edges there. And I can even adjust the size of this if I want to try and get a lot more precise near the bottom of those clouds. All right. Now let's just say I wanted to lighten this. Well, we also have other tools for that. There's my dodge tool. Let's just see that in action real quick. So I put my dodge tool. You see it pretty much does effectively the opposite of what my burn tool is doing. So these are just all tools that we can use to kind of help enhance our images. Now, what good is the sky though, of course, without a sun? So let's go ahead and go back to our pencil tool here, and let's find ourselves a nice yellow that we can work with. And this one looks nice and bright. I'm just going to go ahead and bring that sun up in size here so we get kind of a nice round shape. And oh wait, I don't have a sun layer created yet, so let's go ahead and create a new layer for the sun. And I'm just going to go ahead and paste him in here. And notice right now he's got very hard to find edges, which is fine. I may want him to put him behind the cloud, but for now I have him above the cloud because I want to go ahead and maybe use some of these other tools that I did before. Like for example, maybe I want my smudge tool a little bit so I can go ahead and like maybe try to create some of those nice like lines that are radiating off in different directions to kind of show that this is a nice bright object in the sky and not simply just some statically round object that we might look at. All right, so there's our sun right there. And the nice thing is that now this is in its own layer. I can of course move that below the cloud, for example, and you can see we have our cloud layer. And of course we could play around with the horizon here too. For example, we can add different terrain, we could add trees, we can add a whole bunch of different objects in here to kind of create this scene here. Now the one thing that we do want to do is, and I want to point out to you real quick, is we can add a fill layer. So I'm just going to go ahead and create one more layer, and I'm going to call this, let's just call this tone. All right, and we could call it anything for this purpose, but what we're going to use with this layer is that we're going to go ahead and use this with our fill bucket here. So let's switch to the fill bucket. So there's our paint bucket. And let's just say we want to make this a lot more red. So maybe it's early morning, sky is still kind of red out. So there's my red color. Let's go ahead and fill. Now, you notice it did not fill very much because we don't have a whole selection here on tone. So I'm going to just Control A to select the whole thing. And notice it's not filling in everything because it's at this point simply just using right here, all layers. We don't want all layers. So I'm going to uncheck that, fill that in. And you can see now it's covering the whole scene. But what we want to do is to change the opacity of this individual layer. Now, if I go ahead and change the opacity here, notice it does kind of bring through some of that image here, all right? Because it's controlling the opacity on this individual layer here. So if I bring that opacity up to 100, you can see it's completely cover everything. Go to 0, there's my original image. And so I can actually use this fill layer to actually effectively, by changing the opacity values, add different filtering effects here to maybe change how I want that day to look. I could also have the fill option here, which, as I notice when I play with that, that does not affect an individual layer. That affects pretty much the whole canvas here as well. Because again, it's all going off of this tone layer. It's going whatever my active layer is selected. Because if I go to my cloud, you'll notice that opacity and fill have changed with what they are. So if I go back to here, let's just crank opacity up real quick. And if we play with the fill slider this time, you can see that this also can affect our scene. So this is one way we can use things to quickly, if we want to effectively create like a filter. So let's say we want to make it more like, let's say, a black and white scene, or we want to maybe apply some other kind of filter. We can do that. Now, of course, we do have the option, of course, to come down here. Oh, not a layer mask, but we can use our different filters here, such as hue and saturation, to kind of come in here and mess with. So I'm just going to take tone off for a second here. And I just want to remind you, we can use this to affect certain things here. And you notice this does affect the whole value of what our scene looks like. If I play around with the saturation values, you know that we'll play with that as well. Or if maybe I want to play with the lightness values, these are also good. So I just want to kind of bring these in here to kind of show you a couple other things. But I'm just going to take these off real quick, go back to my original scene. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and quickly add one more thing in, which is just that of just like a quick tree. So let's go ahead and go to find ourselves roughly kind of a brownish color, if we can find one. And if we can't find an exact one, oh, there we go. That looks pretty good. And I'm actually going to bring this down just a little bit. Holding down the shift key, let's go ahead and just drag a little bit to create our tree. And now let's go ahead and switch to a green. This looks good. And what we're going to do is we can go ahead and create a tree. We could say, hey, maybe we want a round tree. Maybe we want a tree that is, you know, a little bigger looking. It doesn't have to be symmetrical either. It could be something like this. But then again, we can use also our tools that we did before to kind of bring in some of those effects to kind of round this tree out, make it look a little bit less jarring. And the nice thing is that this tree can now be its own thing. Now, one thing you did notice is I accidentally put this on the cloud layer, so I'm just actually going to go ahead and use my marquee tool, select that. I'm going to go ahead and cut that out with Control X, make a new layer, call this tree, paste it in. So there's my tree. Use my move tool. I can move that over. And I can actually, now that I have one tree here, is I can actually go ahead and quick select that tree. I can copy and paste this tree and make multiple trees. So now I can have more than one tree, and I can really start making a quick scene here, real quick, real easy, with multiple different trees to kind of help break up the scene here a little bit. So it's not all simply just a blue sky with nothing else in it. And I can also take these individual trees, for example, using my other tools now, and I can merge these layers all down into trees. So let's just merge those down. So merge layers and rename that to tree. And I can, of course, affect these individual trees just to give them some individual characteristics. Maybe I want these trees to have a little different flavor to them, so it's not all simply just copy and paste assets, but it allows us to give also some different characteristics, a little different flair here, so these trees aren't all 100% identical. All right, and that's going to wrap up where we're at today. When we come back next time, let's go ahead and take the same scene now, and let's animate our movement here, so we can show, for example, different times of day, or we can even just have the same time of day with just maybe different tones.